I want to raise a couple of issues that Barnaby Joyce actually put on the table. The first one was when he said that if you close down the scheme, then clearly the compensation that's already put in place goes with it, and that will probably mean tax cuts. So let's hear from him on that.
We've said from the outset that we would not introduce a tax and we will repeal it if it comes in. And, of course, if you're repealing the tax, you're repealing the mechanisms that go with it.
Lisa, I say, what tax cuts? These mythical tax cuts. I mean,
but we're not far away from seeing what the final picture is going to look like.
Let's see it before we speculate about it.
OK, they're mythical at the moment, maybe, but by the time the next election rolls around, they won't be mythical. They will have been in place for maybe 6 months to a year. This is a big problem, isn't it?
It puts the coalition in the reverse position to where it is at the moment. At the moment it's saying, isn't this terrible, there's going to be a tax, and it never mentions any compensation. It's now going to be in the position where the government will say, look here, we're giving all this compensation out, both to Social Security people, probably through tax. They're going to rip it off you, and they won't mention
at this point, they will already have those tax cuts and the compensation, and so the opposition then has to persuade the country that when we withdraw it, prices will go down. Who's going to believe that?
Yeah, that's the great hope for the Labor Party, to get this in, to hand out the compensation and then sort of introduce this concept for the Liberal Party or the coalition of having to roll it back. They'll do that, and they'll have to make that argument if we get that far. There's a lot of water to go under the bridge until then. On the other hand, of course...
getting it through the Parliament.
Getting it through the Parliament for starters. But on the other hand, of course, there'll be price increases. There always are price increases. It'll be very easy for Tony Abbott to go around to every shop and every supermarket, and power prices we know especially.
But then he will have to persuade people that those prices will come down when he withdraws the taxes.
Thing he'll have to explain is exactly how he will manage to repeal the carbon tax and repeal the compensation measures through a Parliament where the Greens will still control the Senate. However which way you cut the result of the next election, the idea that the coalition will control the Senate is pretty much inconceivable. It's a course that's going to be really quite problematic for him.
Look at the lesson of the GST. Labor said that it would roll back the GST. It was so weak in the end it was going to roll it back on tampons and caravan parks or something. But nonetheless, the GST was a much bigger impact than this. Using the sort of price we're talking about, mid-$20 or something like that. The CPI went up by more than 4% because of the GST, and over 2 million small businesses had a very onerous task of filling out these business activity statements. The businesses who are directly involved with this is only about 1,000. Yet when Labor tried to campaign on rolling back the GST, it just went completely...
There's a very big difference, though. When you introduce these new taxes, one of the great fears is that it will be increased. And that was dealt with in the GST by saying there'll be no increase in the GST unless all the state premiers and the federal government agrees. We know with a carbon tax, and this is a very strong argument the coalition will be making, the whole idea of the carbon tax is that it goes up every year.
It has to go up.
Yeah.
Incrementally has to go up.
But the other thing that Tony Abbott will have to deal with is that as time goes on, he's going to have to explain his own policy as well as an alternative, and this goes back to what we were talking about before. If it comes down to an argument about two different ways to reach the same target, he's going to have to explain his way, and there's very few economists and very few people who think that his direct action plan can work, and Barnaby Joyce was talking about this we'll
go to that now. I mean, that was an interview that you had with Barnaby Joyce, and he raised this issue that on both sides of policy, he thinks that what they're doing is a meaningless gesture, and of course that was pretty much a free kick for the government. Here we are.
You've got senior coalition frontbenchers being very clear about what the real policy is, and that is it's just a gesture that you and every other taxpayer in Australia will pay for.
Everyone can have their say. If we go to an election, we can put it forward. No, we're totally committed to it. Is it a gesture? No, we have a serious plan which will meet the targets that the government set out.
I mean, in Barnaby's defence, he is consistent on this. He doesn't believe that human-induced global warming is a problem, so it is quite logical for him to think...
It doesn't make it any easy for them, though.
For him, no, of course it doesn't, to think that there's nothing much that we should do about it. So, having said that the Labor policy was a gesture, it is logical that he would have to argue that the Labor policy was a gesture, given that they meet the same targets. But so then the next question is, Khalil, well, why are you spending $10.5 billion of taxpayers' money on something you think is a gesture? And the interesting thing I thought was that Barnaby would only be drawn on the forward estimates. He kept saying, well, you know, we're only spending $3 billion over the next 4 years, and I don't know what's going to happen after that. I mean, it is a problem for the coalition that I think there are people within the coalition who would be intent on winding back direct action should they get into government, and also that direct action, when you look at it and cost it out in the long term, becomes exponentially more and more expensive to reach the same emissions reduction goal.
Does this become a greater problem if Barnaby Joyce is presented, well, I guess the Labor Party will try and present it this way, as the alternative Deputy Prime Minister at the next election?
No, I don't think it's a problem at all, because people can look at a 5% reduction in Australian emissions and call it a gesture or insignificant without saying they're climate change deniers or the like. It's common sense, and I think this is where a lot of the public are onto this. The point is, at the moment, China emits about 15 times as much carbon or CO2 as Australia. And over the next 10 years, they will double that. Even with all their new focus on renewables and the like, they will double that. So in 10 years' time, they will emit 30 times more than Australia. So it is common sense for Australians to say, if we're going to put ourselves through a lot of pain and expense to reduce our emissions by 5%, it is not going to have any, or it's going to have negligible impact globally.
But if that's the argument the coalition wants to mount, the logical next argument is that they shouldn't have their direct action policy either. You know, they can't have it. My point is that it's contradictory to argue on the one hand, yes, it's a problem, and yes, we're going to spend $10 billion dealing with it, but on the other hand, no, nothing we do makes any difference.
I agree that is a paradox, and the only way you counter it is that some of these direct action measures have other benefits. They improve the fertility of soil, or you revegetate areas of
land. But they're trying to have it both ways on that one as well. The Nationals are arguing against a carbon farming bill that the government has before the Parliament on the grounds that it's going to see tree farms eat up arable farmland. Their own direct action plan assumes tree planting on 10 times as much farmland as the government's plan. So every which way, they're trying to have it both ways.